Welcome to the African News Review podcast, where we cut through the noise and get to the truth. I am your host, Adesoji Iginla, and each week we are here to challenge the biases, prejudices, and misinformation in the Western press about Africa. Using historical context and contemporary insights, we set the record straight and reclaim the narrative. Tune in every Sunday at 12 p.m. Eastern as we uncover the real stories and reshape the conversations about Africa. This is the African News Review podcast, reclaiming Africa's narrative, one story at a time. Yes, greetings, and welcome to a special edition of African News Review. I am your host, Adesoji Iginla, as usual, and with me are my normal guests, and we do have a special guest with us. Without further ado, my sister from another mother, Fubara Eneli Esquire, author Yourself Revolution, host Rethinking Freedom, that's 98.5 Killing, Texas. Welcome, sister.
Thank you.
Our comrade, Milton Allimadi, author Manufacturing Hate, the inspiration behind this program, hosts Black Star News on WBAI 99.5 in New York. Welcome, comrade.
Asante Sam. Thank you.
Well, our guest. It will take me a while, but we shall try to. Our guest is the John J. and Rebecca Moore Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He holds a degree from Princeton, the University of California, Berkeley School of Law, and a PhD from Columbia University. He is a former executive director of the National Conference of Black Lawyers. Dr. Cornel West once described him as one of the greatest historians of our time. We're truly privileged to have him. He has published over 40 books, yes, 40, many of which are the intersection of African American history, internationalism, imperialism, white supremacy, and liberation. Amongst his essential works are The Dawning of the Apocalypse, The Root of Slavery, White Supremacy, and Settler Colonialism and Capitalism in the Long 16th Century. Also a winner of the American Book Award, Confronting Black Jacobins, the U.S., the Haitian Revolution and the Origins of Dominican Republic, The Race to Revolution, the U.S. and Cuba during Slavery and Jim Crow, From the Barrel of a Gun, the United States and the War Against Zimbabwe, 1965 to 1980, or Robeson, The Artist as Revolutionary, Those Against the Empire, U.S. Imperialism in Crisis, White Supremacy Confronted, U.S. Imperialism and Anti-Communism versus the Liberation of Southern Africa from Rhodes to Mandela. He is the recipient of the Carter G. Woodson Scholars Medallion for Lifetime Achievements, the Ida B. Wells and Cheke Ate Diop Award for Outstanding Scholarship and Leadership, the Frantz Fanon Lifetime Achievement Award from the Caribbean Philosophical Association. His forthcoming book in 2026 is The Counter-Revolution of 1893, the Hawaiian Coup, and the Roots of U.S. Imperialism in the Asian Pacific Basin. Professor Gerald Horne, welcome to African News Review.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yes, I have Comrade Milton here to lead the conversation. Comrade Milton, over to you.
Very good. Well, I think you need to introduce the topic, sir.
Yes, the topic would be, obviously, we've all been witness to the unsavory pictures emanating out of Southern Africa. And we have Dr. Horne here to help us understand what has truly been happening behind the scenes and also how history plays into what we're currently experiencing. He wrote a very eye-opening book, White Supremacy Confronted, U.S. Imperialism and Anti-Colonialism versus the Liberation of Southern Africa from Rhodes to Mandela. And we believe he would add invaluable information to us understanding what we are currently experiencing.
Okay, thank you for the setting, brother. All right, so my first question, I guess I'll make it very broad, Professor Horne. What is going on in South Africa today? How does it compare historically to some of the upheaval similar to this that we've seen in the post-apartheid era? And who are the real beneficiaries and the losers in what is going on?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. Second of all, I would say that with regard to the topic of this particular program, what is going on in South Africa is an explosion of xenophobia. There have been killings of Mozambicans, for example. And this is ironic in light of the fact that the downfall of apartheid, given the first elections in 1994, was a product not only of the struggles of people inside the country, it was a Pan-African struggle. It was a struggle that was manifested in the United States of America, for example, which makes all the more ironic, to put it mildly, of what's unfolding. Second of all, I would say that even though this is a national phenomenon, coursing from the Indian Ocean to the Atlantic, it is centered in KwaZulu-Natal. It is centered to a degree in Durban. And there hangs its tail, because you recall that before 1994, you had the antagonists of freedom helping to promote various kinds of Zulu nationalism and Zulu chauvinism. You may recall Gacha Buthelezi, for example,
Yes,
who put forward as a sort of leader of the country, even though his domain was generally on the Indian Ocean coast. And then that leads me to another unfortunate aspect, which is that you may recall that after Nelson Mandela served one term from 1994 to 2000, he was replaced by his deputy, Thabo Mbeki. And then, because of internal machinations within the ruling party, the African National Congress, he was supplanted by Jacob Zuma, who happens to have emerged from KwaZulu-Natal. And rightly or wrongly, Jacob Zuma is castigated and blamed for a number of the many problems that the ANC has had since he came to office. Not only so-called state capture, where Mr. Zuma was able to place many of his cronies in state agencies who then systematically looted the nation. I need not go into some of the personal issues of Mr. Zuma. For example, his being accused of rape of the daughter of a comrade, and in order to become acquitted, his supporters engaged in what might be called euphemistically an unfortunate campaign against the victim, not to mention the fact that at last count, the polygamous Mr. Zuma has about 3 or 4 wives and numerous children, and those many mouths to feed. And then after he was replaced by Cyril Ramaphosa, the current leader, there was a kind of January 6th episode centered in Durban, where there was a kind of mass insurrection against the government. It was quite unnerving, by the way. But I would not want to unduly place the blame for this problem we're discussing at the doorstep of KwaZulu-Natal or Durban, or even Jacob Zuma, for that matter, because there are larger forces at play. And you can see this in the person of the current leader, Mr. Ramaphosa, in his biography. Cyril began as an attorney for mine workers, for example. You might recall that on the day that Mandela and his comrades were released from prison, and they had the rally in Cape Town, as I recall, you might recall that it was Cyril who was holding Mandela's microphone, so Mandela could read his remarks. But speaking of 1990 and the release of Mandela, that takes place against the backdrop of what might fairly be called the collapse of what had been the ANC's major ally, which had been the socialist camp, which was arming the ANC. I talk about that in length in my book, as a matter of fact, not only arming them, but providing health care in various sanatoriums and hospitals, for example. And Mr. de Klerk, the last apartheid leader, made the calculation by his own admission that this would be a worthwhile time to negotiate with Mandela and the ANC, because their backup was in the process of decomposing. And so the agreement that was negotiated, which has been criticized, sometimes in a one-sided fashion, because the criticisms have not gone to what was happening globally. It focuses on the concessions and the compromises that the ANC had to make. But the concessions and compromises were a result of a certain alignment of forces globally. And this impacted negatively the ANC. The African National Congress, the ruling party, had been a broad church with many pews, including capitalists and communists. But with the changing global correlation of forces, you see that the capitalist forces gain a certain undue influence. And once again, this is reflected in the biography of Cyril, who starts off as a lawyer for mine workers and today is a billionaire. In fact, he may be in the process of being impeached because of foreign currency found in a couch in one of his residences, for example. So this leads inevitably to the results of the last election, where the ANC loses its majority, feels that it has to go into a kind of shotgun marriage with the so-called Democratic Alliance, the neo-apartheid party, which to a degree is a reflection of the domestic alignment of forces. But at the same time, it is a hindrance with regard to the pressing question, which is redistribution of the wealth, for example, redistribution of the resources, for example. And we all know the U.S. administration is playing a malignant role, not only sort of a personal antagonism towards Cyril. You might recall that Mr. Trump said that he would not go to the G7 meeting in France if Cyril was going to be there. And so Cyril was not allowed to land, and instead, the so-called African representative was President Ruto of Kenya, believe it or not. And then there's the immigration policy of the United States of America, putting forward this canard of a so-called genocide against the Afrikaners, in particular in South Africa, a canard boosted by the once and present first buddy, Elon Musk, a so-called trillionaire on paper, and who contributed approximately $250 million to the campaign coffers of Mr. Trump in 2024, and then was rewarded by running the so-called Department of Government Efficiency, which ran roughshod over the federal workforce, particularly in Washington, D.C., where they're disproportionately of African ancestry, for example. And then the cherry on the cake is, despite the anti-immigrant ethos of Mr. Trump, he has made a noticeable carve-out, an exception for Afrikaners. Thousands of Afrikaners have flooded onto these shores at our expense. We're subsidizing their presence, believe it or not. And once again, that outrage, to a degree, is reflective of the domestic alignment of forces in the United States of America, where you had 77 million voters in November 2024 vote for this felon across class lines in the settler descendant population. And so despite protestations to the contrary by some, Mr. Trump is not an anomaly. Mr. Trump is wholly and totally consistent with the trajectory of this so-called republic, which on July 4th marked its 250th anniversary, although I took note of the fact that even mainstream supporters were unclear as to whether or not there would be a 300th anniversary, for example. I should also add that likewise, what's happening in South Africa is a reflection, I'm afraid to say, of the history that I have outlined, wherein the European settler descendant population wields outsized influence in both the economy and within parliament, that this, to a certain degree, was an outgrowth of a negotiated settlement that eventuated in the elections in 1994. Those negotiations, as noted, were shadowed by the fact that the anti-apartheid forces were losing their ally, which was in the process of decomposing, which at the same, like a seesaw, was strengthening the United States of America, billing itself as the sole remaining superpower. And as noted, then and today, a major supporter of not only so-called white minority, but also Zulu chauvinism, which they see a tool to destabilize progressive movements. So I've probably spoken enough.
No, you have done,
So
Professor Horne, you've done an excellent job in putting the historical context. Before I turn it over to Sister Aya, I might say, as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking of the days when Mandela was saying there's a hidden hand fueling the killings right before the elections, and nobody wanted to believe him until later on when the facts were actually revealed. And in your summary, you've been able to demonstrate very clearly that the Nigerians, the Ghanaians, the Zimbabweans are being clearly scapegoated. And then one final comment is there's an interesting interview with Steve Biko. It's available on YouTube. If anybody goes to YouTube and just put Steve Biko interview, it's about 27 minutes long. I think that was his last year of life. And he said, if we believe that ending apartheid in South Africa just involves replacing the white leaders with Black African leaders, and that's it, without addressing the means of production, the wealth distribution, the income distribution, then tomorrow would have been the same as yesterday. And it seems there's a lot of that going on as well. And at some point, if you care to comment on any of the, what I just said, feel free to do so, Professor Horne. I'd like to turn it over now, though, to Sister Aya. Sister Aya, I think you're on mute. You're on mute. Go ahead, Sister Aya.
No, I was just saying that it would be great if Professor Horne goes ahead and comments on what you just talked about.
Well, let's just focus on the hidden hand concept. Certainly, revelations have emerged since 1993, 1994 to suggest that Steve Biko was onto something. With regard to 2025, 2026, those revelations, as far as I know, have yet to emerge, although it wouldn't surprise me if that were the case. Although, once again, what's on the record is damning enough. I mean, what's on the record, as noted, is disproportionate influence wielded by an elite that is heavily dominated by Afrikaners, that they are significantly and profoundly right-wing. And then we also know that across the border in Zimbabwe, when there was an effort to engage in land redistribution under the previous government of Robert Mugabe, sanctions were slapped on Harare, sanctions that continue to sting. So, in other words, the North Atlantic countries and their allies, for example, in Australia, not least, are quite comfortable with this maldistribution of wealth to the point where they are willing to penalize and punish and pulverize any government in the region that moves to change that unsustainable status quo. So that is on the record. That is common knowledge, and that is sufficiently damning in and of itself.
Okay, thank you for that. Sister Aya.
Yes, Professor Horne, in your book, The White Supremacy Confronted, you trace these colonial and apartheid era labor systems and how they deliberately pitted Black South Africans against migrant workers from other places in the continent. You also show so many parallels between the civil rights movement, if you will, the peak of the civil rights movement here in the United States of America, and growing interactions with Africans on the continent and that whole independence movement too on the continent. As we look at what we're calling Afrophobia, we call it Xenophobia, but targeted towards other Africans in South Africa. My question would be, I'm looking at the anti-Blackness going on in South Africa at this time. I'm also looking at the anti-Blackness going on in the United States of America at the same time. Do you see any parallels? Can you shed any light? Or maybe I'm not seeing anything here at all.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Just taking a quick break here on the African News Review podcast, but don't go anywhere. If you're enjoying our deep dive into the real stories behind the headlines, make sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Every Sunday at 12 p.m. Eastern, we're here to debunk the myths and bring you the truth about Africa. Want to help spread the word? Share this podcast with your friends and leave us a review. It goes a long way in helping others discover the real Africa. Without further ado, let's get back to setting the record straight.
Well, no, I think you're onto something. And in my opening remarks, I should have mentioned other culprits. For example, some of you may be familiar with the film distributed by Hollywood, District 9, which is sort of a science fiction film that portrays Nigerians in South Africa as aliens from outer space who are ravaging the domestic population. I kid you not, you should look at it, quite intriguing. And certainly there is a parallel between anti-Blackness on both sides of the Atlantic, not to mention anti-Blackness in Western Europe. As a matter of fact, I've been waiting for a football analyst to do an analysis of the World Cup. Not only in terms of, say, the odds-on favorite that is France, which has a significant number of Africans leading the way, but also we recall that in previous international sporting events, for example, the Olympics, when you had this black sprinter in Canada, Ben Johnson, when he was winning, he was Canadian. When he was exposed, he was doping, he was black, for example, which helps to undergird this sort of anti-Blackness that you're referring to. So once again, the alignment of forces helps to shed light on why this anti-Blackness might be waxing and not waning. That is to say that in the book, I talk about the parallels, as you note, between the struggle against U.S. apartheid, Jim Crow, and the struggle against apartheid itself. But at a certain point, many of our liberal so-called friends and allies decided to opt for anti-communism. They tossed overboard the folks who were close to the ANC, led by Paul Robeson, the tallest tree in our forest, the late, great Paul Robeson, and then received anti-Jim Crow concessions in return, anti-Jim Crow concessions that are now on the chopping block. Recall what has just befallen the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the crown jewel of the anti-Jim Crow movement. But this anti-Blackness in the United States also incorporates an anti-immigrant ethos, and that's represented in a very narrow victory in the U.S. Supreme Court, granting the legitimacy of birthright citizenship. That is to say, if you are born in the United States, you are a U.S. national. The right wing wants to overturn that, and even though the U.S. Constitution, which is supposedly the supreme law of the land, speaks explicitly about the legitimacy of birthright citizenship, they barely failed in terms of overturning that.
Yeah.
That is the precursor and the prelude to the imminent deportation of thousands of Haitians, among other Black people. Next on the list, I'm afraid to say, will be denaturalization procedures.
Yes.
What I mean by that is that Jamaican Americans, Zimbabwean Americans, etc., will have their immigration or their naturalization, their citizenship, U.S. citizenship, investigated, flashbacked, and then that will lead to their being deported. And many native-born so-called Black people are not aware of the fact that they're also on the hit list. They what gets me about Black people in the United States is that there's a sort of cognitive dissonance. On the one hand, they talk understandably and justifiably about white supremacy, and one of the more popular mass organizations is a religious organization that posits that these Euro-Americans are actually devils, for example. Many Black Americans subscribe to that. But on the other hand, they expect the law to work in a just fashion. I mean, that makes no sense. And so when you talk to Black people about possible mass deportation of native-born Black Americans, that can't happen. We were born here. Well, I mean, if they were aware of history, they'd be aware of the history of Liberia, started 200 years ago as a way to get rid of Black people. They'd be aware of the fact that during the U.S. Civil War, there was an attempt by the Lincoln government to deport Black people to Brazil. After the U.S. Civil War, there was an attempt to deport us to the Dominican Republic, deport us to the Congo. After the Spanish-American War of 1898, there was an attempt to deport us to the Philippines. And so this idea that we're not on the list, in fact, you can throw up a great wall separating so-called foundational Black Americans from other Black people. I think it's ahistorical. I don't think, first of all, it's sort of illogical. I mean, given what, as I said, people know about white supremacy, you can't argue. It's like the lawyer arguing, Your Honor, my client is innocent and he won't do it again, for example. I mean, you can't argue this premise of white supremacy and the malignancy of same and then expect the law to operate in a just and rational fashion. Those are inconsistent concepts.
Absolutely.
Well, I say all that to say that we're talking about South Africa, but to a certain extent, we're talking about the world. And to return to the thread, I was watching the U.S. play Bosnia-Herzegovina, the World Cup the other day. Did anybody see that? So anyway, so the U.S. team, they have, as is typical of many sports, they have this black star.
Yes.
And then the referee ousted him from the game. Ousted him from the game against Belgium, too, by the way, on Monday, because he accidentally stepped on the ankle of a melanin-deficient Bosnian. And then those of us who are familiar with the games recall that Lionel Messi, the Argentinian star, did more or less the same thing, and he wasn't expelled. And then that raises the contradiction of the United States, which they're going to have to resolve this contradiction, which is the contradiction being that it's acceptable to have Black Americans in sports play at the top level. As a matter of fact, you have college athletes who can make seven-figure salaries playing basketball, for example.
In college.
And it's going to descend to high school, too, sooner rather than later. At the same time, the Trump regime is trying to purge Black people from colleges. And at the same time, they're paying these Black basketball players $1 million to come to the college. Something is going to have to give. Those, once again, it's two irreconcilable concepts that are at play. And so I was wondering when a football analyst would do an analysis of the World Cup that brings into play some of the things I'm talking about. For example, the game yesterday between Paraguay and France.
The incessant fouling.
Sorry?
The incessant fouling of the French players, and the referee just turned the blind eye.
Yeah, I mean, now the fact that this is taking place in the heavyweight champion of white supremacy, speaking
and
of
in Philadelphia as well,
for the most part, and the games are also taking place in Canada and Mexico. And we should not necessarily be shocked nor surprised by it. But I haven't seen. Part of the problem is that the U.S. ruling class, and there are 77 million supporters, they get upset if you start talking about white supremacy. And so these sports analysts want to keep their jobs. And so therefore they don't talk about what is obvious. Obvious as the nose on your face, for example. But at some point, somebody's going to have to break through and do an analysis of this. As a matter of fact, I might have to break down and try to write something.
I think so.
I was going to say, you sound like the best person.
We encourage that totally, and we'll make sure we distribute it to the appropriate sports analysts.
Yeah.
I see. Okay, fair enough. So in other words, sister, yes, you are onto something when you're drawing parallels and drawing connections between what's happening on both sides of the Atlantic, because what's about to happen to the Haitians in some ways is similarly cruel to what's happening to, for example, the Mozambicans. in South Africa.
Yes.
Okay. Yes, we've talked about the hypocrisy of the Western style democracy with regards to Africa, and we constantly see it play out. I want to draw your attention to when the Berlin Wall fell in Eastern Europe. And you had the likes of Nicolae Ceausescu, Henrik Honecker, Ceausescu being the leader of Romania, and Erich Honecker being the leader of East Germany. They were both dragged before court. In the case of Nicolae Ceausescu, he paid with his life and his wife. Erich Honecker was allowed to eventually leave trial based on ill health, and he will eventually relocate to Argentina.
Chile, I thought.
In Chile, yes. So in your book, you highlight there's a part there where you said Mandela and the ANC in particular were shocked that Frederick de Klerk and his wife were getting state recognition, wherein they presided over a similar type thing in Soweto. That should have been a pause for thought. And why is it that Africans have to go through stuff like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but cannot ask for compensation in terms of, finance, and as we're talking about it, the redistribution of land is a non-question at the moment.
Well, thank you for that question. I mean, first of all, with regard to Erich Honecker and East Germany, as I point out in the book, East Germany had been a major supporter of the ANC. I used to get, during the anti-apartheid era, the weekly information bulletin of the ANC, which was published in East Berlin, for example. And this was a reflection of this kind of support. Now, once again, these matters come down to the global correlation of forces. Not only the global correlation of forces, but then certain weaknesses ideologically of the Black community in this country, for example, as a direct result of the compromises made in order to receive anti-Jim Crow concessions. I mean, for example, the Black American community, speaking of compensation, has high on the agenda this issue of reparations for the devastation of the African slave trade and of slavery. A just and worthwhile demand. Yet at the same time, we're in the midst, as noted, of this heavyweight champion of white supremacy, for example. So in order to force through that just demand, obviously you're going to have to lengthen the battlefield, just like we had to lengthen the battlefield during the battle days of slavery, and embark on international alliances. But most Black American leaders, intellectuals, and organizations are blissfully unaware of the major forces globally that help to shape this small planet.
Yes.
They're blissfully unaware of the alliance between Russia and India, the alliance between India and Japan, the contradiction between India and China, for example, the alliance between Russia and China. So, and then the United States, I would say inadvertently, has helped to boost yet another center of power, speaking of Iran.
Absolutely.
As a result of this disastrous February 28th war. And that's another power that we have to take into account. But so on the one hand, you have these Black Americans, they have this justifiable demand for reparations, even though affirmative action is on the chopping block and on the way out, but fine. We're up in the ante. We say we want reparations. That's going to have to require global alliances, but people are not aware of what's going on in the world. And so obviously it leads to a certain kind of political and ideological constipation, for example. And you could say likewise with regard to South Africa, where there is more attention and understanding of the world, because after all, they have sovereignty, they have diplomatic legations all over the world, for example. They participate in the United Nations. They participate in the World Trade Organization. They participate in the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, for example. But at the same time, as of today, although I see this as a pattern that will be dissipating sooner rather than later, but as of today, the U.S. and its North Atlantic allies wield undue influence globally. I don't see that as a long-term proposition. The issue, however, on this side of the Atlantic, so that will benefit ultimately the just demands of the African majority in South Africa. With regard to the Black population in this country, theoretically, it could benefit us. But if you're not aware of the levers that need to be pushed, you cannot take advantage of it. As a matter of fact, you can make an argument that as the United States is forced to retreat globally, it'll be forced to retrench hemispherically, hence the pressure on Cuba, hence the pressure on Mexico, even Canada. Canada is the 51st state, according to Mr. Trump. And also, it has peril and danger for the Black American population as well. But if you're not aware of all this, as I said, you're sort of blissfully ignorant, for example.
Can you expound on the danger to African Americans?
Well, I mean, look at what's happening today and then multiply it. I mean, for example, look at infant mortality rates, look at sighting on death row, look at victimization by police terror, for example. Look at disproportionate unemployment rates, for example. Look at the wealth that was lost as a result of the machinations on Wall Street in 2008, 2007, for example.
Yep.
Look at the AI bubble, which is bound to burst sooner rather than later. And that could lead to enhanced exploitation, Black American community, which might lead the nostalgic and the wistful looking back at today as the good old days, for example. So that's what I'm hinting at. That's what I'm suggesting.
Professor
I want to quickly interject to this point that Professor Horne has just made. I don't think we've paid enough attention to the changes to student loans and the classifications of the different degree programs and how that's going to impact the Black community. We know that statistically we have taken out more loans to be able to get our education. And right now, that big bullshit bill, if I could use that term on this platform, drastically limits the amount of student loans that families can access from the federal government. And that is going to impact the numbers of Black students that are able to go into certain fields or even complete those fields. We have some young people who are just now applying to medical school, the professional schools, and those cuts are about 50% in terms of what you can get in terms of student loans. And yet the tuition and the cost of education has not gone down at all to reflect those cuts that have taken place. And I believe they're surgically, that Project 2025 was set up in such a way to really undercut any economic and political gains we have made as people of African descent in this country. Very concerning.
Very concerning. Go ahead, Brother Milton.
No, please go ahead, sir.
No, I think Milton wanted to interject something.
I don't know. I mean, I wanted to get back to the point you were talking about, the alliances. Obviously, that at the end of the day is a solution to empowerment, to our survival, and to implementing some of the things that need to be changed. Eventually, we are to transform the structures in South Africa, for example. And it's not only South Africa, it's globally. We are going to need these types of alliances that you mentioned. But at the same time, the platforms to have these conversations have disappeared. Back in the day, we had the non-aligned conference, which was very important, which was a product of Bandung. Those platforms no longer exist. So how are we going to have these conversations when we need them even more than ever right now?
Well, to a degree, they're continuing. I mean, I recall with interest the fact that I believe it was in the fall of 2025 that there was a substantial Black American delegation in Addis Ababa at the African Union meeting. There was a special presentation on reparations, which, of course, Barbados and many of the Caribbean countries have played a vanguard role.
Yeah.
And I should have mentioned that when I was talking about reparations and global alliances, that sort of event. But with all due respect, I think we're going to not only have to align with the African Union and CARICOM, we're going to have to go beyond that, because we're going to have to take the dangerous maneuver of breaking bread with real or imagined antagonists of Washington. And I think that there has been a reluctance to do so, because we recognize that Washington takes that very seriously. When Black people seek to make these sorts of alliances, you can make an argument that led directly to the assassination of Martin Luther King, for example, when he began speaking out against the Vietnam War, or in February 1968, when he spoke at Carnegie Hall at a session sponsored by Freedom Ways magazine, which was the organ of the Black left, which had ties to the socialist camp and to the Bandung Plus movement that you just made reference to. And then a few weeks later, he was killed. Perhaps a coincidence, perhaps not. So part of the problem amongst Black Americans is that part of our culture is to be oppositional, because that's what got us to this point thus far. But embedded in that oppositional culture is the recognition that those who we are combating and fighting against are wholly ruthless, totally unprincipled, murderous, and understandably, people don't want to lose their lives, which I totally understand.
So, given what's happening in South Africa, what are concrete steps that should be taken to address this? I mean, do we just stand back and watch what's going on? What are the steps that African governments or the AU or civil society can do to address the economic desperation that we all see is driving this xenophobia, this Afrophobia? And how do we address the failure of African countries, African governments as a whole, in protecting migrants? Because, of course, this is not the first time we have seen Africans kick out other Africans from their country.
Well, obviously, I shouldn't say obviously, we know that a number of governments on the African continent have had urgent consultations with Pretoria in order for Ghana to send an airplane into South Africa and board Ghanaian nationals to return them to safety. Obviously, there are consultations taking place with Pretoria as to why it's necessary to send that plane and why it's necessary to repatriate so many Ghanaians. With regard to civil society, that's part of the obligation of folks on these shores. We need to have a delegation meet with the deputation of the South African government in Washington or the United Nations mission in New York City, expressing our concern and wondering about what the government is doing in order to restrain this sort of violence, this sort of xenophobia. But once again, it's a global phenomenon. I noticed what happened in Belfast, Northern Ireland, just a few weeks ago, when a Sudanese man was accused of stabbing an Irishman. And you had these Irishmen dressed from head to toe in black and masks, going door to door, burning out African migrants with arson campaigns, for example, egged on by Elon Musk. And speaking of civil society, I don't recall any of our organizations protesting what Elon Musk was doing with regard to Northern Ireland, or protesting what he's doing with regard to these Afrikaners coming to these shores. Because most of our organizations, they don't have an international agenda. Now, on the one hand, you could say, well, it's because domestic issues are so pressing, but domestic issues were pressing under slavery. But you still had Frederick Douglass spending an inordinate amount of time in London, for example.
Well, we didn't even speak up. We didn't protest what he did with Doge. So that systematically undercuts so many African American women and men from the federal government.
So ultimately, what we keep coming back to, and I say this as the NAACP is about to embark on its national convention. I'm not sure what city it's taking place in. That I would be very surprised if these sorts of international issues are on the agenda, because they haven't been on the agenda since, I would say, 1948, when the NAACP made this turn towards accepting civil rights concessions in return for deep-sixing internationalism. That sort of maneuver has yet to receive the kind of exhaustive analysis it so richly deserves.
Okay. So, Professor Horne, another observation I have.
I think the screen is frozen.
Okay. While he is trying to come back in, just a quick question on the issue of internationalism. I notice capital does not have any problem with borders. But for some reason, yeah, of course. But for some reason, Elon Musk has been trying to go into South Africa with his Starlink business.
Mm-hmm.
But we all know the Black Empowerment program is in place, which asks any company coming in has to yield 30% of their business to the Black population. But we then notice that since he's been told no, there will be no exception to his particular business. That's when we had the genocide, and now subsequently this. Can we tie capital, the blockage of capital by the South Africans, to what is currently going on in South Africa?
Well, obviously, there's a contradiction between the mobility of capital and the immobility of labor, for example. And yet another way to look at what's going on in South Africa is to look at it through the lens of the immobility of labor. That is to say, coming across the border from Mozambique is frowned upon. But South African capital moving into Mozambique is acceptable. But then that bespeaks the weakness of the labor movement, in this country not least. Fortunately, despite what we've said today, you do have relatively speaking, a strong labor movement in South Africa amongst the mine workers in particular. And I think that's one of the reasons why there'll be challenges from the left to the ANC in upcoming elections because of dissatisfaction, this relationship with the so-called Democratic Alliance, the neo-apartheid forces. So once again, as we do a kind of critique, as well we should also look towards signs that might be more hopeful. And Brother Milton, I see you've returned, so would you like to interject?
Yes, thank you for that. I'm sorry. So the late Walter Rodney used to like saying the system.
Now there's some sort of
the fan you have on is blowing into your microphone.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, much better.
Yes.
Yeah.
So the late Rodney used to like saying the system always finds answers, meaning they adapt, they anticipate, and they do whatever they have to do. So now, barely 30 years after apartheid, there are people who now say, what apartheid? What are you talking about? With African independence, by the 1980s, when structural adjustment was taking hold, people are talking about what colonialism? What are you talking about? And it's also, we've been in the situation of what slavery for a very long time as well. So it seems like our biggest challenge is to outwit the system before the system adapts. And you provided us with some wisdom today. But before you part, are there additional wisdom you can share with us in terms of how we can preempt the system before the system adapts?
Well, I think
it's a broad question, I know.
Sure. Our organizations need to be more globally minded, for example. As I noted, the NAACP is having their annual convention. I know that many people have washed their hands of the NAACP. But on the other hand, it is a mass organization. I mean, you have to intervene in mass organizations, for example. It's not the only mass organization, but it is an important secular mass organization because, of course, we have a number of non-secular mass organizations. I think also we need more debate, ideological debate within the Black community in the United States, for example, with regard to what might be called anti-immigrant ethos in the Black community, for example, which manifests itself with regard to not rushing to the defense of the Haitians who are about to be deported. for example. Ultimately, not rushing to their defense, among other things, is an ideological question. Obviously, it calls for the Congressional Black Caucus making that a priority. But once again, what we do know, and we should not be a Pollyanna about this, is that the Trump coalition has certain red lines, one of which is anti-immigration, mass deportation, denaturalization, what I've already made reference to, and another is anti-affirmative action, anti-DEI, anti-diversity, equity, and inclusion, for example. They're willing to tolerate corruption on the part of the Trump family.
Yep.
If Mr. Trump is pursuing these priorities. And you saw the article, I'm sure, in the New York Times about these crypto schemes that have enriched the Trump family in the hundreds of millions, if not billions,
Yeah.
since January
Billions.
2025, for
Yeah.
example. So, we have an uphill climb. But if it's any consolation, this is not the first uphill climb that we've had to traverse. I'm afraid to say that being Black in the settler colonial regime involves a series of uphill climbs. So, with regret, I'm afraid to say that I have another webinar, believe it or not, I'm supposed to participate in. So,
I just want to thank you for your wisdom and sharing your time with us today. Adesoji Iginla, to sign off for everybody.
Yes, again, we have to thank Dr. Horne for taking time out of his very busy schedule to spend with us explaining what it is we're looking at and how to go about navigating it. Thank you, Dr. Horne. Thank you.
So,
Sorry?
Dr. Horne, 30 seconds, if you can respond to this. How do you see what's happening in South Africa right now impacting the politics? Does it appear that the ANC has failed and that they're economic apartheid stayed in place? Are they going to politically hand the country back to their colonizers based on what's going on right now? If you could answer that in 30 seconds.
well, I don't think that
However much time you have.
Well, I don't think that's a prospect in the short term, but I would not rule it out in the long term. With regard to the short term, as I said, forces to the left of the ANC embodied in the trade union movement of the South African Communist Party are planning to run third-party candidates in the next elections. I shouldn't say third party, that's a U.S. term. Or to run alternative candidates in the next elections. We'll have to see how well they do before we can make a larger determination as to whether or not the neo-apartheid forces, as represented in the Democratic Alliance, are making a comeback. Keep in mind, the Democratic Alliance has been able to co-opt a number of Africans as well.
Yes.
And this is a direct result of, once again, the bargain that the ANC was forced to accept in the prelude to 1994, whereby redistribution of wealth was generally off the table. And, Black economic empowerment, which led to Cyril becoming a billionaire, was seen as the way to go. So it's too soon to tell whether the premise of your question will eventuate.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And with that, we've come to the end of this week's episode of African News Review Special. Next week, we'll continue with regular programming. And until then, it's good night and God bless. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Horne.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good luck to you all.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
That's a wrap for this week on the African News Review Podcast. We hope you are leaving with a clearer, more truthful picture of Africa. Remember, every story has another side, and we're here to uncover it. Don't forget to join us next Sunday at 12 p.m. Eastern as we continue to challenge the narratives and reclaim Africa's voice. If you've enjoyed the show, be sure to subscribe, share, and leave us a review. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep seeing Africa for what it truly is.